may be seated. Before I begin, I would like to recognize that Reverend Terry Epelbarger is here with her wife Eileen and their long-term friend here from Seattle. And so thank you for joining us this morning. It's a blessing. So make sure to say hello to them. Terry is the pastor of Sacred Journeys? Many Journeys. There's so many Journeys MCCs these days. Many Journeys MCC in San Mateo, California. So, also a prayer request that I didn't put on the list. Let's continue to lift up the women of color in Congress who are facing so much hatred right now, and not just them, but all of the women of color who are represented in this country and underrepresented, really. Would you pray with me, please? God, we pray for closeness with your wisdom, with your word that is eternal, always has been, always will be, is unshakable, lives within us and among us. Make us more aware of that holy presence. May the words of my mouth and the meditations of all of our hearts bring peace and justice to your world in the way of Christ. Amen. When I was 12 years old, I went on a middle school retreat with my Methodist Church's youth group, and I was nervous because I was a shy kid. I take after my mother that way. And I wasn't very social, and I didn't know what to expect from the retreat. We went into the beautiful mountains of West Virginia for spring break. Wildflowers were in full bloom. We stayed in cabins, we took hikes, and took paddle boats out on the lake. And on the second day there, I learned a way that Christians can be fallible. One of the chaperones went out on the paddle boat with me, and a gust of wind sent his toupee flying into the lake. And then some unholy words came out of his mouth. And all I could do was giggle, but he didn't think it was so funny. But that broke the ice for me, that even the holier than thou Christians are fallible. On the last night of the retreat, we all sat around the campfire and took communion together under the stars. And it might have been the first time that I'd taken communion, at least that I can remember. And our youth minister, Wendy, told us about Jesus and how much he loves us. And while looking up at a million stars and taking that simple sacrament, I asked God if we could be friends. And it was as if God said, let's go on an adventure. My inner life transformed from that point on. With all the turmoil and loneliness of my childhood, I finally had an eternal friend. Soon after that experience, I began preaching at the age of 13. I preached a few times a year in the church of my upbringing until I was 17, and I had come out by that point. During that time, I led prayer groups, led worship, and attended retreats and Christian work camps, and my faith became my strength during that time. And I've always known that I was attracted to the same gender. I had crushes on boys since I was 4 years old, I can remember. And I actually started to wear my mom's wig and clothes when I was 4 as well. And whenever I was alone in the house, I would sneak into my parents' room and put on that red lipstick that I love so much. And I would just glare and glare in the mirror. And I guess that's when Trina Get You Some was born. I didn't want to be a girl. I was just fascinated with gender. I was also fascinated with God since I was a small child. I remember teaching myself to meditate without knowing what it was called. And I was maybe 3 or 4. I had a special hiding place under the record player where I would sit and just be. I would slide the console door open and crawl in and shut the door behind me. And in that perfect darkness, I remember feeling like I remembered being in the womb, safe, warm, growing. I guess I've always been a mystic. A mystic is someone who has a natural inclination to feel the divine on an intuitive level. Even before I knew the word God or went to Sunday school, I knew who God was. God was my friend then. But until my middle school retreat experience, I all but forgot. Growing up began to erase that element in me. But I did spend most of my childhood in the state park that led up to my house in Maryland. And almost like Snow White, I befriended the trees and the animals. I played Oprah and interviewed the squirrels and the birds. Yes, I've always been a queer child. And I took refuge next to the flowing creek. I dove into my imagination about what had happened among those trees over the centuries, when those tall trees had just been little buds. This is what I know to be what Jesus called faith like a child. It's a faith with an open heart. It's a vulnerable faith. It is a trust that God will guide the path even when I feel I am lost. It's a right-brain, creative faith. It doesn't require dogma, doctrine, creeds, or fear of a boogeyman. All it requires is a deep love for life, and that is what I had. A deep love for life is a fundamental element of adult spiritual maturity. The paradox that Jesus gives in the Gospels is that we are to be mature through being childlike. Note that there's a huge difference between being childish and childlike. Being childish is demanding what you want without regard to the needs and desires of others. Sounds like some political leaders. We also call this ego. And there's a sort of annoying element to childishness. But being childlike means embracing the creativity that we're born with. It means remembering that we are co-creators of our lives with the one who gave us life. And it's been said that the creative adult is that child that survived. Being childlike is wise. The other element of adult spiritual maturity has to do with a willingness to be a lifetime learner. Even when we graduate from one school or another, we are always learning. A diploma is not an ending, it is a new beginning. My grandmother was still learning in her 90s. After being a very conservative person her whole life, she saw the direction the world was going and she voted for Obama before she died. I'm so proud of her. We are all still learning. Don't be ashamed of it, embrace it. Some of my seminary colleagues were in their late 60s, preparing to start ministry at that time. They hadn't given up on their dream of becoming ordained ministers, and they took a leap of faith and attained their goals. It is never too late to learn. Mary, in our scripture today, embraced the opportunity to learn when she could. She sat down at the feet of Jesus and listened intently. And in Jesus' time, that was not proper for a woman to do. Women were not supposed to listen to the wisdom of rabbis. They were only supposed to serve them politely. So Mary's sister Martha did as society told her. She worked away in the kitchen to entertain Rabbi Jesus. The scripture tells us that she was distracted. And I heard a funny addition to this scripture from a pastor friend of mine who said, what Martha said that's not in the scripture is, okay, fine, but dinner's going to be late. Martha notices that her sister Mary is transgressing gender norms by placing herself as a student of Jesus and asked, "Don't you care that she left me to do all the work by myself? Tell her to help me." Instead of catching himself off guard with the rules of society, Jesus tells busy Martha, "Only one thing is important. Learn from Mary. What she has chosen is eternal." So yeah, maybe she should have helped her out. But the point of this story, the point of the scripture, is to be close to that wisdom, to be open to it while it's right there. Jesus, I believe, was a mystic himself. He had taught Mary to be a mystic too. Jesus empowered women throughout his ministry to embrace the Spirit of God that was with them. When Mary did this, it absolutely shocked Martha. This may have happened to you too. People who knew you for a long time learned of your spirituality and suddenly became intrigued. And I encourage you not to, proselytize and tell people they need to get saved. I've been told that many times, right? But to share your experience of how your spirituality enriches your life. Could you be a mystic too? Might you be? Christian mysticism has been condemned for a long time by the institutional church because being a mystic means subverting oppressive power. When we are truly connected with God with an unsurpassable, vulnerable trust, God takes precedence over the powers of this world. And that scares people in power, especially those who claim to speak on behalf of God. In the 4th century after Jesus, the Roman Empire chose to become Christian. It had long embraced the Roman pantheon of gods and goddesses, but gradually embraced Christianity. And this was a blessing and a curse at once. On the side of blessing, the Roman Empire would stop killing those pesky Christians who challenged the empire's oppressive ways. They even outlawed crucifixion. On the other side, Christianity itself would be changed for the worse for the rest of history, in my opinion. When any group becomes the dominant group, it is destined to become tainted by power. As feminism and womanism teach, only shared power is good. We know by historical record that for 1,600 years the Christian church has used the name of God and Christ to oppress peoples around the earth. It has killed those who refused to convert, such as during the Inquisition, the Crusades, and the genocide of Native Americans on this soil. It's embraced anti-Semitism. It's officially damned all non-Christians to eternal torture. And remember, the Nazis claimed to be Christians. Doesn't sound like the God of love to me. This kind of history alone is enough for millions of people to stay far away from anything bearing the name Christian. But I stand here because I still have hope. Though the institutional church has carried this oppressive power for 1,600 years, there has always been dissent within the church from a minority that disagrees. Over the centuries, these folks have been identified as mystics as well. They were not necessarily ascetics, those who are hiding away from the rest of society just to contemplate. There have been many bold saints who have stood up in the face of abused power and bad theology to say instead that all people are born with original blessing and are sacred children of God. Among that cloud of positive thinking, loving, creative witnesses, as living theologian Reverend Matthew Fox lists, are these folks: Hildegard of Bingen, Francis of Assisi, whom the current Pope of the Roman Catholic Church took his name, Francis's close friend Clare, Mechtilde of Magdeburg, and Thomas Aquinas, and all of them in the 11th century. And then there's Meister Eckhart, a German Christian theologian in the 13th into 14th centuries who was declared a heretic by the institutional church, but has been revered by Christians, Buddhists, and Hindus alike for centuries. Teresa of Avila of the 16th century reminded humanity that we are the hands and feet of Christ, and that Christ is indeed our mother. We never forget astronomer Galileo in the 16th century who insisted that the world is spherical and revolves around the sun. And then George Fox of the 14th century who recognized the divine spark in every human being and founded the Society of Friends that we know as Quakers. And more recent on that list of mystics include Sojourner Truth, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., Dorothy Day, Mahatma Gandhi, Albert Schweitzer, lesbian feminist Audre Lorde, and the list goes on and on. We are not alone. Are you in the list of mystics? Do you, with your whole being, embrace a trust in the divine mystery that created the universe? Do you believe that the whole human family has been created good? Do you believe that human potential is always greater than human downfall? Do you value the earth that God has given us as the most beautiful gift for our use and not our abuse? Do you recognize God in the world every day? Then you're on the list. If only just some of these things. You may be a mystic. And mysticism is not witchcraft. Some people throw it into that category for some reason. And it's not a silly celebrity fad. And it's not confined to the category of New Age that fundamentalists warn people about over the airways. No, mysticism is looking into the sky as I did as a young adolescent and just standing in perfect awe of God's creation. It's saying, wow, I must be special to be alive in this universe. And at the same time, thinking, wow, I am so small compared to this universe. And also, wow, this universe is within me. I challenge you to try on the title of mystic. See how it fits. And if it gives you joy, if it feels right in your gut, and if it helps you to feel whole, then I encourage you to embrace it and move forward. So for the rest of our time together in worship, consider remembering the times when you may have had a mystical experience of God. It doesn't have to be some kind of supernatural, out there thing. It could be a still experience. It could be looking into the eyes of a lover. Whatever it is, sit in that experience. When do you experience God's presence the most? Would you pray with me? God, may we never forget that you are ever present to us, that we don't have to call for you to come down from some throne in the sky, but that you are enthroned in our hearts forever. May we be able to live in this world, knowing that presence so that it decreases our suffering and it soothes the suffering of those around us. May we always and forever be grounded in your most holy presence. Amen.